Get out of the practice session because there's no participants. Rachel, is anyone there? Oh, there's 2 participants. No, there's 3 attendees. Interesting. Well, let's do it. Oh, here they are. They're popping up. Wonderful. Okay, we're ready when you are. Oh, we were recording. Hey. Hey, everybody. Welcome this evening to the second to last of the spring speaker series for the Center on the Future of War. We had a few minor technical difficulties, but we're thrilled that you're joining us this evening. We have a fantastic speaker tonight, Janet Reitman, who is one of the ASU Future Security Fellows at New America this year. Many of you are familiar with our center and familiar with this particular position, but for those who aren't, I'll just give you a quick overview. The New America Fellows programs are one of the most interesting programs in the country for supporting powerful storytelling, usually supporting book projects, as in the case of Janet, but sometimes supporting films and other kinds of programming. Each year, 350 to 400 or so people apply, and something around 15 or so people are selected, so it's enormously competitive. Our program supports 2 to 4 fellows each year who are named ASU Future Security Fellows at New America. So they're part of this complex competitive process. They tend to be working on issues related to security, but broadly understood. Janet's writing a book that's the subject of her talk about the unraveling of America. This is what she'll speak with all of us about this evening. She is a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine, has had a couple of really major pieces this year and in the past. She covers extremism, youth, and national security. Her book is coming out from Random House. It's about the demoralization of post-911 America and presents a narrative history of the country's increasingly violent and extremist drift from the 1990s to the present. She's a former contributing editor at Rolling Stone and has twice been a finalist for the National Magazine Award, so one of the most prestigious awards related to magazine writing in the country. Her first book is called Inside Scientology, the story of America's most secretive religion. She may talk a little bit about this and about the process of reporting on controversial subjects and trying to tell the stories of those who have different perspectives than Janet does and than many of her readers. That was a national bestseller and a New York Times notable book. And we were just talking before this event about how Janet's work on that book happened shortly after she did around a year long of reporting from Iraq during the early years of the war there. So anyhow, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. We're thrilled to have Janet with us today. And the way we'll manage the event is a little different than often. Janet will present a brief overview of her work, her project, and where she's at with it. Then we'll begin a conversation, and we'll be open to questions from all of you pretty much at any time that you'd like to. So to participate, type your questions into the Q&A box in Zoom. I'll play the role of moderator. I'll try to get to everybody's questions, but feel free to type those questions in really at any time. And again, thanks for joining us. And Janet, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So you're catching me in the middle of like what has been a multi-year process, and it's reaching a very intense deadline period. So I've been writing all day and very much in my headspace of trying to work through this very complicated book. So I'm giving you that as a little bit of a prelude, a preface to this talk. So bear with me. I started this project in 2017, believe it or not, after I published a story about a neo-Nazi youth group called the Atomwaffen Division for Rolling Stone magazine. And it was about a group of boys who met on the internet and became involved in this, very, very extremist group. And actually 2 of them wound up getting killed. And one of the families was this middle-class family, upper middle-class family from the Boston area, who were kind of blindsided by the fact that their son was even involved in this kind of a real-life group, though they were fully aware that he had, an SS flag in his bedroom and that he had had a kind of a fascination with the neo-Nazi movement. And they sort of looked at this as a teenage phase, like an adolescent phase. He had an older sister who was about, I guess, 16, 17, 18, his sister was in college. She did not, and she saw this as beyond a phase, and was very, very concerned about this, and could not get either her parents or even the FBI, believe it or not, to take it very seriously. And then he died. And so I was really interested initially in, like, how does that happen, right? Like, how does that happen? How do you have someone who embraces that level of extremist ideology, who speaks openly about their, really who embraces a completely different worldview, a completely different understanding of history, who believes the Holocaust was a fiction, who believes Adolf Hitler was a pretty good guy, who believes that African-American people are responsible for way more crime in America than whites, who believe that the races, should all live separately, like, the whole sort of white nationalist agenda. How do you live with that and not be super alarmed? Like, what level of denial, in a sense, are you living with? And the parents in this case are kind of, they're Gen Xers like myself. And so we had this long conversation over a lot of, actually now it's been a couple of years, over, kind of the assumptions that we made about America growing up in my era. Like, I grew up in the 80s and the 90s, and actually also the late 70s. So I, lived through the Reagan era. I had a very different understanding of America, all the way up until, September 11, when everything sort of began to change, especially rhetorically in this country. And there were sort of this whole jingoistic, a kind of jingoistic, as I would consider it, a jingoistic kind of patriotism broke through and began to define our lives, and very clearly define who was an enemy, who was a friend, what was a patriot, what was a traitor. Things began to be interpreted and articulated in that way. And that was something that just, like, did not exist really before that, to that level. And we just had these, like, our kind of a conversation about how what we assumed about our country, what we assumed about being American, this assumed righteousness, this assumed goodness, like an assumed sense that for as much as you may disagree with your country's policies politically, perhaps, there was no question that we were the greatest country on earth, that our democracy was superior, that we had a very clearly defined enemy in the Soviet Union. And even after the Soviet Union fell and we were kind of drifting around looking for the new enemy, there was still this sense that we were the only superpower, we were the greatest country, all this stuff. And the generation of their son, Andrew, who's, I guess, like a Gen Zer, they have had a very, very different experience, and their children's all of their lives was defined by this post 9/11 era. So I began this book initially thinking I wanted to write about how it was that, middle-class white kids became neo-Nazis. And it expanded to look at what happened in the post 9/11 era that led us, to a place where we're now, the place that this book will likely end is probably around January 6th in 2021, the year 2021. And how do we get to that place? Like, how do we get to such an eruption of pain, anger, chaos, kind of almost like a vomiting out, in my view, of like everything awful that has happened to people in the past 20-something years kind of came out at that moment. How do we get to that place? And so this book is the story of, I'm just thinking now, four main, really 3 or 4 main storylines or story characters. One is the Suburban Family. one is the story of several different people who worked in white men who worked in law enforcement and within the government in a very idealistic, kind of way, and in one way or another became quite disillusioned by what they found working for both the FBI and for DHS. One is an African-American, this amazing person named Terry Albury, who I wrote a very big story about earlier this year for the Times magazine, who was an FBI agent. And he's an African-American guy, an FBI agent who ultimately, who was worked counterterrorism for 16 years and was so destroyed by what he had to do that he wound up leaking a lot of documents to The Intercept and went to prison for several years. And the other story, which is what I'm working on right now, is the story of a guy named Nathan D'Amigo, who was a very, very well-known for a moment white nationalist. He founded a group called Identity Europa, which is like it was the group that kind of helped to lead and organized that would happen in Charlottesville. And he is a guy from a Christian conservative background and from California who joined the Marine Corps and went to Iraq in the mid-aughts and came back with a significant amount of trauma, untreated PTSD, and wound up going to prison for several years, about 4 years, and in prison discovered white supremacy. And where I am in the book right now is trying to explain how he fell in love with this concept, like why this appealed, and what about creating an organization that would essentially model itself in a way after the Hitler Youth. Why that was something he wanted to do, and how did he go about promoting and selling that and turning that into a success, which is what they did. And I should add, before I move over to some questions, that Identity Europa, which no longer exists, changed its name to something called the American Identity Movement. And the American Identity Movement, which also recently disbanded, and it became part of what's known as America First. And America First essentially has infiltrated Republican politics, and I believe is playing quite a large role in Arizona, though I don't know every single detail on this because I haven't quite done all that reporting yet. But it's the ideas that were promoted by Identity Europa in particular are now mainstream ideas of, believe it or not, of the Republican Party. To me, it's surprising because I'm not a conservative. So, and one of the things that I struggle with as writer is to, I'm objective. This book is not a polemic, and it is not. It's not even really a kind of a piece of distance journalism. It's a narrative like history, and it's really told through the perspective of these characters. And it really requires me to kind of get in their heads. And it's hard with certain people whose ideas may really, really differ from your own. And I think that's the big struggle right now. So on that note, Daniel, you can ask me whatever question you'd like. That's the end of my little short presentation.
Thanks so much, Janet. So we had some exchanges before we all came online on Zoom and in the last couple of weeks. And to build on the point you just made, which is that this is a book of reporting, not so much just standard reporting, but like you say, the telling of a history through a series of characters. And many of these characters, like a lot of your reporting actually, hold ideas that you do not hold, and that you may even find troubling, reprehensible, problematic. So what does it mean to get inside the heads of these individuals who you're profiling in the book? And what's the struggle as a writer to effectively convey their feelings and thoughts without being polemical? And just how do you go about the process of doing that?
I mean, I think that, so in my career, I have written about like the people that we would consider bad guys for a long time. Like I profiled, I wrote about the Boston bomber, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. Like I've written about, I portrayed him as a normal adolescent, actually, which is who I really deeply believe he was until something happened to him and he became this other, kind of monstrous person. My whole kind of goal with writing about people whose ideas I don't believe in or agree with is to humanize them, which is not to normalize their behavior or their beliefs. There's a real difference. And I think it's really important to point that out, that we talk a lot in our culture right now about normalization and platforming or deplatforming, so as to not give voice to people whose ideas, we see as dangerous. Like, I disagree with deplatforming, actually, because as a researcher, it's impossible to actually do your job if nobody, if people's, words have been taken off the internet or removed from the public domain. But in terms of, sort of normalization, I don't think that humanizing people who embrace, ideas that we might, or, deeply disagree with, or that strike us as deeply un-American, for example, is normalizing. It's just accepting that they're part of our society. And so as a writer, like, what I kind of have to remind myself constantly is like, this is not, no one I am writing about is an anomaly. No one is born, for example, a terrorist. No one is born a monster. Some people, there are some people who are genuinely sociopaths, but many, many people, if you look at people who commit acts of terror, they are not sociopaths. They were not born this way. They have come to these ideas often very recently, and often very much incidentally. And if you, talk to people who are, who study, sort of the terrorism experts, people who actually, spend their time interviewing terrorists for academic research, what they'll tell you is that, if you survive, if a person survives, a suicide attack or some kind of terrorist attack, they will say that another day they might not have done that, and that's genuine. And so I don't think that's the same thing with those people who have a true ideological belief. I think that ideological belief builds itself up over a long period of time and kind of sticks with that. But that, when you look at where we are right now in our country, we are driven by ideology and divided by ideology. And so to sort of not accept that certain ideologies that we don't, that I personally may not agree with, is not part of our culture, would be to deny the reality of our country. And so, like, it's really about grappling, as a writer, it's about looking really, like, the role of journalism is to fearlessly, stare truth in the face, right? And like, I really seriously try to do that, as kind of pompous as that sounds. That is the goal, is to write truth. And if I can do that, I think people will recognize it as so.
So quickly, just to remind anybody who has a question out there in our audience, please put that into the Zoom Q&A box. So Tsarnaev is a very different sort of figure than I believe the figures you're profiling, in the sense that in reviewing his experience and what he did in his life, he was a real outlier, I think, based on the title of your book and our conversations, that you're profiling a number of individuals not as outliers whose ideas are on the fringe of society, but rather that there's some aspect of these white supremacist ideas that are either in the mainstream, migrating to the mainstream, or otherwise just affecting and expressing the general or general trends within American society. So could you just elaborate a little more about that and what that means?
Well, I think that, so Dzhokhar Tsarnaev is not in my book, mostly because I had to make a decision in this book whether or not I was going to focus on I had there's a major theme in this book is the fact that, our law enforcement agencies and the government did not and has not, until very recently, really focused on domestic extremism, on white supremacy, on those ideas, and they focused instead on, quote unquote, Islamic terrorism. And I had intended on actually writing about some kids that wanted to join the Islamic State, and I decided against this ultimately with my editor, but Tsarnaev does fit into that, in that, like, all of these young people that join these movements, they're missing, something is not working for them. Something they're looking for, they're all often, what unites a lot of these people is idealism. They actually they want something more. Like that, this kid, his parents, I wound up spending all this time with, and I'm writing about Andrew Oneschuk. He was like a deep idealist who hated life in suburbia, was bored, and wanted something more meaningful than what he was getting in typical suburban, upper middle class, private school kind of life. And I find that across the board. I find that with all of these kids that wanted to join groups like ISIS, that they somehow fell on the outs of what they consider to be the mainstream of society. And that's the same with a lot of these actually with a lot of these white kids. They also feel that way. Something in their lives, something in their home lives, something in their schools, is dissatisfying to them. And these kinds of extremist groups, they prey on that. So, but I think that, and that's one sort of avenue of the book, is looking at the way in which relative, really innocent people, they're 16, right, 17 children, are preyed upon by these people. Now, in terms of like an older person like a Nathan D'Amigo, who is well into his 20s when he discovered this stuff, and when he became a leader of this group, he was almost, I think he was 30 or 31, he was an adult, and he became a propagandist. When it comes to something like that, and when you look at what the propaganda was, which was basically reframing white supremacy as what they called identitarianism, and making this a movement of, well, it's about white civil rights and white rights to have a voice on campus, and it was an anti-political correctness, CRT, anti-ethnic studies, anti diversity, anti-multiculturalism kind of movement. And their outreach to young white guys was like, you all feel really bad. You go to school, or you're in some, social environment where people are trying to make you apologize, or you don't have a voice, or, you have to worry all the time about saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing just because you're white. And, we think that's wrong. We think you should be proud. You have a proud heritage. You're European. That is part of, I actually find that whole narrative scarily identifiable. If you, this is very controversial. If you're white, I'm Jewish, but I have white skin. I'm European. If you are a person who is not of color, I think that it is, whether this is hyped or whether this is reality, and I'm not in academia, so I don't know. There's a lot of messaging around, what do you have the right to say? What can you say? What can't you say? Whose voice hasn't been heard? Do you have the right to tell somebody's story who is not, for example, of your own race, or who has not had certain experiences? If you haven't had certain experiences that your character has had, I've had these conversations with a lot of different people, and I hear that kind of anxiety that is echoed in the genuine white nationalist, white supremacist rhetoric. And so that anxiety is like, I think, much more pervasive in our culture than maybe some of us want to admit. And that's how it works on, especially on young white guys, it seems.
So we have an interesting comment here from a colleague at ASU, Lee Babut, who you know, who
Hey,
who he's here. I'm just going to read the comment because that's our system here. He says, writes, I think the approach of humanization is important. If we do not see the complex humanity of those we disagree with, then we may see them as definitively other. And that ultimately stops us from being introspective. In other words, it may be that humanizing someone, in this case, Nathan Domingo, might not be important for understanding him, but for readers to understand themselves and how they or those they love can be radicalized. So
exactly.
before responding to that, maybe for everybody else who's with us, you might provide a little background on this story and how it plays into your book. And then if you could respond to Professor Wood's comment, that would be wonderful.
Oh, sure. I'm so happy that that he is with us. So Nathan Domingo, I've just talked to you a little bit about. After he was in prison for an armed robbery that he committed when he was just back from Iraq. He robbed a man who was he thought was an Iraqi. He was very drunk and he was possibly a bit disoriented about where he was. But he had a gun on him, and we went to prison for 4 years, 5 years. And when he came out, he enrolled in college in California, where his parents lived, and entered a new world and he had become a white supremacist in prison. So when he gets out, he wants to find other like-minded people, and of course he finds them on the internet, which at the time had a very small community, rapidly growing, but it was at the time fairly small. And he and a fellow Marine Corps vet created a group, an activist group that they called the National Youth Front. And the idea was, in their minds, that they essentially recreated a new war. They created a war that they could believe in. They were very disillusioned veterans from Iraq. And they saw that there was a real war happening on American college campuses over race and identity, and that this was where white people were being, in their minds, this is where white people were the most at risk or in danger or being victimized, and that they should confront and call out liberal, quote unquote, liberal hypocrisy, and if they could find examples of sort of egregious behavior in their minds, they would turn that into a campaign. And Fox News and other conservative outlets, like campus conservative outlets, were at the same time, sort of on the warpath about classes like Professor Buick's, I think it was called, is it U.S. race theory and the problem of whiteness, is what I believe it was.
Sorry, Janet, was that at ASU or was that at the California University?
It was at ASU.
Useful for this context, thanks.
This was a course that was taught at ASU. And I believe it was ethnic studies. I'm talking to the professor here who taught the class, so I'm hoping I'm not getting this wrong. But I believe it was ethnic studies, yes. And it was called U.S. race theory and the problem of whiteness, which is what these guys seized upon. It was seized upon initially by Campus Reform, which was a national kind of right-wing news outlet that's run by the Leadership Institute, which is like, a kind of a right-wing activist training ground based in the DC area. And they have these, their job is to be kind of like they see themselves as like a super conservative journal of higher education or something like that. And they seized upon this course. What were they, what was being taught? There was a book about critical race theory. There was, a book about, I don't even remember all the titles right now, but like, basically books that challenged our views on race and presented whiteness as perhaps a problem. And this became actually a national story that was discussed on Fox News. And so Nathan Domingo and his friend Angelo John Gage, who was the other Marine, they jumped on this and made this their first campaign. And they created flyers with the professor's picture on it that said anti-white, and they spread them all over campus, and they spread them all over his neighborhood, and they really created, and that, drew white supremacists who, wrote threatening emails and made threatening phone calls and created a whole environment in which, and then the national, both the local and the national media also kind of got on top of this, and it created a very tense environment for him, for the school, I believe, and for the white supremacists, it was a victory because they had this was the ultimate triggering of the libs, right? This was the ultimate, and they didn't get in any trouble for it. And so that empowered them to go further. So that was kind of Nathan Domingo's very first experience with activism. And it was from his mind to his mind, it was just a tremendous success. And it had, I think, a very devastating impact on Professor Bibu, but that's the backstory to that. So now to answer the question on, you have to re-ask it because I just told you this long story. So
yeah,
sorry.
You had a very interesting comment. You mentioned that these two Marines, so yeah. Domingo and his colleague, that they created a war they could believe in.
Yep.
As veterans of the Iraq War, at least at a certain stage in the Iraq War. How significant do you think the post-9/11 foreign wars, 20 years of these conflicts and all of that it implied, how significant is all of that in that particular history to the subject of your book, to the idea of this unraveling? Where does it fit in?
I think it's like the central theme, actually. It's a central theme. I don't think that, in fact, most of the characters in this book touch on, their lives intersect with the war on terror in some way, the post-9/11 wars in one way or another. But I think that the climate that was created in that era of, sort of a fear climate for a lot of people, but also for younger people, it created a kind of a real, like a hero, sort of a hero warrior myth mentality that they could strive for. And I think a lot of them did. I think that it's hard for me to kind of completely explain how you can draw a direct line from September 11 to where we are now, but I deeply believe that you can. It's a very complicated to kind of, explain that in a short amount of time. But I think in terms of, these soldiers, these guys, what you have to, keep in mind is that a lot of these far right movements, a lot of these extremist groups attract veterans. They've made a direct appeal to veterans, but the veterans themselves reorganize in this way. And I think it's really interesting to look at, it's not incidental to me that not only are these guys that I'm speaking about veterans of the Iraq War, but they're veterans of the first phase of the Iraq War. They're veterans of the Bush era. And that's really different than the Obama era. The Obama era was a time when, this war was going on and on and on, and you can, in Afghanistan too, on and on and on. But everybody, was tired of it, and it was broadly acknowledged. Obama had run on ending these wars, particularly Iraq. He had run on the stupidity and senselessness of Iraq, and how can we get out of there as quickly as possible? And so that is a very different war than the war that George Bush declared, which was a holy crusade, which was righteous, which was supposed to be the new World War II for this generation, for this millennial generation that went off to fight it. They all went off thinking that they were going to be like their granddads fighting in this heroic battle against, evil, and they were sold that concept because, the line that the Bush administration promoted was that Saddam had something to do with 9/11. So they all went off in 2003 and 4, 2, 3, and 4, and 5, genuinely believing in this. And I mean, I could tell you because I was in Iraq in 2004, and there was like a lot of sort of never forget 9/11 propaganda everywhere to reinforce that in their heads. And so people who believe that, when they recognize that this was a lie, when they realize that there were no weapons of mass destruction and that Saddam had nothing to do with September 11, and when they realized they weren't fighting, they had not, there were, Al-Qaeda came over to fight them ultimately, but that was not the original thing. That created this deep, deep disillusionment. And some of them found outlets in places on the internet that blamed it all on the Jews, that blamed it all on the globalists, that, blamed it all on these conspiracies. And that created this whole, there is a white supremacist conspiratorial narrative, an deeply anti-Semitic, white nationalist narrative that is directly connected to 9/11 and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And you find a lot of veterans who have cycled sort of down that rabbit hole. Some of them go very far left, and some of them go very far right. And both are extreme, and both feed into the current moment.
So we have two questions here from folks attending, from Candace Montano, asking about to what degree were those individuals you're profiling and those drawn to these white supremacist movements, do they come from upper middle class homes? And the response here from Lee Bavot, many people who fight in the military are not white. Can you say a bit about why it is that the white folk are becoming radicalized, but not veterans of color? So I see those as somewhat linked. If you could sort of connect them, because the question here is partly to whom are these narratives appealing, and to what degree do they appeal to some and not others, and just how do you sort of process all of that? The white and upper middle class, where does all this play into the appeal?
Okay, I mean, I am speaking. I've covered the military a lot. Okay, so I'm just going to say that, like, I'm not making a guess, but the military is a giant, giant organization. The vast majority of people in the military, whether they're white or Black or Latino or Asian or anything else, are not radicalized at all. But the Marine Corps in particular is very specific, and a lot of these guys, if you look at I've been looking at some of the people that were in the January 6th insurrection, a lot of the ones who were in the military, a lot of them were Marines. And there's a reason, I think, for that, which is that the Marines are, number one, they're whiter than the other branches, but they also project a very kind of a traditional elitism and a warrior ethos that is in many ways really out of sync with modern warfare. I mean, they're still like promoting, storming beaches and things like that. And they draw from, and this is true for the Army too, to some degree, they draw, when it comes to the white people who join the military, a lot of them are coming from like legacy families, people who have had, parents or grandparents have been in the military, who work in law enforcement. A lot of them, Nathan's father was a cop. He was a Marine, but he was also a cop. His grandfather was a sheriff, I think, or a sergeant, local police sergeant. His dad was a deputy sheriff. His uncle was a sheriff. They had a huge law enforcement thing in their family. Everybody had been in the Marine Corps. And so he's following in a family tradition. And same thing with this other guy, Angelo Gage. His dad was in this, I believe he was also a Marine. Another one fought in World War II. Like, this is all this tradition. And it's not only is it like a person who joins an organization like this is trying to emulate their dad or grandfather or whoever, but it's actually a self-selected like mentality. It kind of creates a culture that is very separate from the civilian world. Marines are really trained to look at civilians as kind of nasty and different, separate, not, this is a law enforcement kind of a military kind of mentality of that, their job is to protect the rest of us. They're special, they're separate, they're, elite, whatever. They're standing up for real America. They own the values, they own the right, they own patriotism. This is their birthright. America is this whole concept of sort of Americana is very much woven into that specific kind of group. I wouldn't say this is certainly, I've also met African American Marines who have that same set, they feel the exact same way. But I think that there are tremendous opportunities that the military offers, young people, and particularly young people of color, like they grab it. All these kids, I think a lot of kids that join the military, certainly the ones that I met in Iraq, most of them did not join because of 9/11. Most of them joined whether they were white or black or whatever, because they didn't really have anything else to do. And it was a great way to get an education. It was a way to remake their lives. But I think when it comes to radicalization, if you do come from that kind of background, if you do come from that kind of mentality, it's and the military indoctrination will drum that into you even further. Then the sense of betrayal that you may feel when you get out and you perceive that your country is now not oriented around you, that your country is giving breaks to people that don't look like you, that claim special privileges because of their ethnicity, that can lead you down a path of feeling like you've been cheated, that you've been, this is really like, this is the central thing I struggle with trying to explain, because it's hard, but I'm also not a guy. So there's also this whole, like, it's a white male thing that's kind of baked into this. And look, there have been soldiers of color who have become radical. They've become radical in other ways. It happens, but I do think that something is up with the white soldiers from that particular post 9/11 moment, that they also, a lot of them, the PTSD rates were extremely high and they were not validated. This was another aspect of the Bush administration versus the Obama administration. Obama, paid attention to post-traumatic stress and paid attention to suicide. And even though they did not do a terrific job, and in many ways they paid lip service to it and did not really, solve this issue at all, they at least, encouraged the US military to tell its soldiers that it was okay to feel the way they were feeling, and that it was okay to seek help, and that help was there for them. The kids that went to serve in 2003 or 4 or 5, especially if they were Marines, they did not get that when they came home. They were told, to suck it up. They were told if they complained about their mental health, they might get chaptered out of the military with 0 benefits, which is what happened to Nathan. Some of them would get chaptered out with these fake made up, conditions like adjustment disorder, which completely separated them from the veteran community. It separated them from their GI Bill, separated them from disability. There's a lot that's been written about this. It was terrible what happened to them. And so some of this, like, you can really look at some of the mistakes that were made during the Bush era and the way they tried to sweep these kinds of, the byproduct of a war that they hadn't really planned for under the rug, without really factoring in the impact it was going to have on people. And, many of these people, I would love to know how many of these, for example, the January 6th insurrectionists, a number of them were not honorably discharged from the military. And I would be very interested to know how many of them had post-traumatic stress that either they did not get treatment for, or had trouble getting treatment for, or had in some way struggled with. Because that would be very typical of that particular generation.
So interesting, you're making a connection between a series of individual stories of radicalization, of white supremacy, of overt white supremacy, and in some cases of those who suffered in the early stages of the post 9/11 wars in ways that were not addressed. But how do all of these ideas and this deep-rooted resentment of a particular population, in what way does that migrate, and how does it migrate to become a more standard accepted ideology, or at least narrative among, that's widely held within by many in the country? What allows that to happen? What are the commonalities that make that resonant?
I mean, I think that white supremacy or um, white structural racism, if we wanted to look at it like that, is very much a part of the American identity, and that we ignore that at our peril. That that's what this current conversation has been about, nationally, like rewriting history to give other groups their actual rightful place in history, looking at how children have been taught history, looking at what's been omitted, and I think that we have to kind of accept that about our own upbringing, our own teaching, our own preconceived ideas. Like even myself saying, I had this view of America. I had a white view of America. I'm a white upper middle class girl who went to a private college and excellent high school, and like progressive family, but like didn't have a Black friend until I became an adult, because I didn't know any, because they were not in my school.
So is the unraveling of everything?
So the unraveling of everything is kind of the unraveling of a lot of the myths of our country, a lot of the myths that we grew up with, a lot of the myths that we believe in, and a kind of a reconfiguration of who we are. And I think that we're in the middle of that reconfiguration. We have not come out of that. We do not know where we're going. And the white supremacist view of it is that we are going to divide along racial lines, and we're going to emerge as a racial, like a monoculture. Maybe there'll be 6 monocultures in this one land, or maybe everybody else will be sent back to where they came from, and the whole country will be one white Anglo-Saxon Protestant monoculture. But that's their view, that's their vision. And Donald Trump shares that vision, and plenty of other people shared that vision, and all that he did was he became a vehicle for a vision that has already been very much a part of this country. And that was something that a lot of people felt uncomfortable speaking, I guess, and he gave them permission. And what you saw was the permission structure. And then you saw that the beliefs that are, it's surprising and sort of horrifying that these beliefs were held by lots of people, that in fact, plenty of people were willing to say racist things uncensored. Since the president of the United States said it, plenty of police officers or FBI agents came, I know this from my own reporting, they came right to work wearing MAGA hats. That's not even allowed, right? But it happened not necessarily in Washington, but it certainly happened out in these field offices. Plenty of people in our country buy into some of these ideas. They may not consider themselves racist, they may not consider themselves anti-Semites, but do they feel, for example, the January 6th crowd, 70 or 80% believe that most of them came from counties in this country that have had a radical demographic change. So they were coming from blue counties that were no longer as white as they had been. And the one animating idea that they had, which is the same idea that Nathan D'Amigo and his movement promoted, was the Great Replacement, was this idea of white people, white culture, white America, white American culture, whatever that may be, being usurped by brown people, by Asians, by people who are immigrants, who are not, and that this being a plan of the Democrats, of the elites, of the global elites, to weaken the gene pool, to destroy the traditional country, to turn America into something else, to turn America into something that doesn't look like what they think America is. And this is what drove them. This is a mainstream idea. It's very, very scary. This is what Tucker Carlson talks about. This has now become a mainstream idea. This is a fundamentally white supremacist idea. And it goes back to the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And it's become a mainstream idea.
So there's a question here from Wilbur and Midor. And it's related because you talk about how members of law enforcement are, in some cases, drawn towards these ideas. And then you previously mentioned how just a concern for domestic terrorism was not recognized until quite recently. And as you may know, some of our work in New America, because for those unaware, our centers of partnership with ASU and New America, and some of the work there focusing on domestic terrorism showed that in the post 9/11 era, domestic terrorist attacks were by right-wing groups, if you want to call them that, were as common, if not more common, than by groups claiming, an Islamist orientation or a link to.
They were much more common, if I'm recalling.
Depending on the data, but yes, but so this was happening throughout the post 9/11 era, despite not getting attention. So the question here is, would the FBI agree with you that law enforcement is not focused on this problem, and what would be their response?
Well, I think they do not agree. I've asked them the question many times. They officially do not agree. Unofficially, you will find people within the FBI who will say, and certainly within the Department of Homeland Security, former members of the Department of Homeland Security, who will say that that there was, you have to look at you have to look, like another story in this book is about the post 9/11 FBI and the pressure that was put on agents in the post 9/11 FBI to pursue counterterrorism and make cases, open investigations, recruit informants, justify this gigantic budget that was given to the FBI to fight terrorism or to protect this country. This whole idea of creating a sort of a homeland security apparatus was completely oriented around, Islamic terrorism. And so that became a self-reinforcing situation where you had plenty of agents who realized that they were manufacturing cases, that these people they were looking at were not guilty of anything. But they continued to do it because this was how they had to do it. They had to meet certain quotas so that their office could get their little piece of the budget pie. And this was made very, very clear to them. And so that was a real problem. I think that two things happened when it came to white supremacy. The white supremacist incidents like the sovereign citizen movement was really a big problem. And they were going after law enforcement. And there were plenty of people in law enforcement, local law enforcement in particular, who were asking the federal government for a lot of help and not getting it because the resources, once again, were focused on Islamic terrorism. Today, I wrote about this in 2018 about how the FBI took its eye off the ball, both the FBI and local took their eyes off the ball of white supremacy, and enabled it to grow and become a bigger movement. And since then, and I think partially as a result of that story, there was a lot more attention paid to this, and all of a sudden you saw congressional hearings about domestic violent extremism, as they call it. And there is much more pressure put on the FBI. And so you see a case now in Michigan of this militia group that the FBI may or may not have helped to manufacture a whole plot around killing Gretchen Whitmer. But there are, 20 people or something, like 18 people who are, in various stages of legal proceedings over this potential domestic terror plot to kill the governor of Michigan. And there was, the use of multiple informants, some of whom may have actually helped to manufacture the plot. And this is all this is all being worked out currently, and we'll see what happens with that. But that is an example of the kind of pressure that the FBI did feel, similarly to, I think, after Oklahoma City, where all of a sudden you see them going after a lot of these groups, they go after low-hanging fruit, though. They're not necessarily, it's taken them quite a long time to go after the January 6th guys. It took them, it's taken them like a couple of years now, right? Finally arrested Stuart Rhodes of the Oath Keepers. So I think that the tendency has been to regard domestic groups as kind of a bunch of, fringe wackos, and not look at them as a serious threat, because we tend as a country to look at threats as coming from the outside. We look, I think a lot that's common to many, many countries, right? Like every nationality looks at the other as the threat. And that's very much the case in the United States. And that's been very much part of our history, whether it's the Red Scare, whether it's, even in the 90s, there was this great fear of, like Islamists that from the First World Trade Center bombing, and then, or suicide bombers or hijackers or whatever. There's always a kind of rhetoric around this. And then we had this after 9/11. So I think it's much more difficult for them to look at their own children, their own neighbors, their own family members, and and recognize that these ideas that they hold could also be dangerous. They could be.
We only have a few minutes left, so I wanted to ask you one question that came out of your comments, which is, you talked about this unraveling as partly being a dismantling of false myths of the United States. So to what degree is maybe all this process something actually very healthy for the United States, something necessary?
I mean, I don't know. I think it's. I think that I would love this. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen with Ukraine, but it's been heartening to see people coming from all. I mean, I know white supremacists who have come, behind the Ukraine cause and are like, I think would love to sort of join hands with people from other political persuasions, which is surprising. I would love to see this country stop hating each other so much, and I'm not sure when we'll reach. I really thought that with the election of Joe Biden that we would maybe get, I mean, this is the naivete of like hope, but I thought maybe we would move past Donald Trump and past, focusing on relitigating various, slights and on accusing one another of false narratives. Like I really hope that we would maybe try to embrace a more common truth. And I'm not sure, I mean, I'm thinking maybe this Ukraine thing will become a common truth that everyone can unite around. Watching another country be overtaken by a monstrous other country. I mean, I don't know, but I don't think that I can completely see a future where the United States breaks apart, just like lots of countries have broken apart. I could completely see a future where we are, where this is like Rome, the end of Rome, which has felt like for quite a while, and that's it. I would love to see a future where somebody, we find a way to bring ourselves back from the brink. But I don't know what that will look like. Will that be a white majority country? Will that be a country whose history is white history? Or is that going to be a country whose history is a multicultural history? Is that going to be, I think that there's a real fight now about who owns history, who owns this country? Because a natural progression of a country that is egalitarian is, it's about the majority, it's about change. And I think what we're experiencing is this tremendous aversion and fear of change. And are we going to move past that? And I don't know, because it's very difficult as a writer, because truly, you can't think anything is going to get worse, and then it does. Like you just think, okay, that's the craziest thing that's going to happen, I'll stop here. And then something crazier happens. And you're like, oh no, I have to like factor that into what I'm writing. So I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. This is one of the many questions I'm grappling with.
So on that note, we've come to the end of our time. Thank you everybody for spending some time with us this evening. Thank you so much, Anna Reitman, for working on such important issues. We very much look forward to the book. And to everybody, have a great evening.